So today's presentation is brought to you by the Paul S. Sarbanes Transit in the Parks Technical Assistance Center, Alternative Transportation Systems Training for Federal Land Management Agencies. Today's presentation title is Good Practices to Encourage Bicycle and Pedestrians on Federal Lands. Our presenters today include Natalie Vilwaukee-Whitty, who is a research engineer with the Western Transportation Institute at Montana State University, and David Farrer, who's a principal with Western Slope Consulting, LLC, Dan Dressler, who is a park ranger from Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, and Charles Borders, who is a branch chief for the National Capital and the Southeast regions, representing the Denver Service Center. For additional specific information about our presenters, we've included full bios in the handout section of Live Meeting, so if you'd like to learn a little bit more about them, you can. And then without any further ado, I will hand the webinar and the agenda description over to Natalie.
Thank you, Ember. This morning we are going to begin by talking about essentially the benefits of integrating bicycle and pedestrian modes. And then we're going to go into the different 11 parts that consist of the good practices to encourage bicycle and pedestrians on federal lands, which are divided into 4 different sections. I'd like to highlight that Davis will be speaking throughout each of these sections. Dan will be coming in on section 3 under the Encouragement Education Enforcement Programs, talking about a tour at Mississippi National River and Recreation Area. And Charles will be coming in under Evaluated and Monitored, talking about both the Mount Vernon Trail and a little bit about Rock Creek Park. So to begin, why would you want to integrate bicycle and pedestrian systems into existing federal land management area transportation networks? Really it comes down to these 5 points that you see here. With resource protection, bicycle and pedestrian networks, as you can see from this photo, require a lot less space than, say, their motorized counterparts. You could also reduce greenhouse gas emissions because, of course, bicycle and pedestrian are people-powered. In addition, bicycle and pedestrian networks often allow users to get a lot closer to resources, and therefore it often improves visitor enjoyment. A lot of the studies that have been done where people are specifically looked at doing walking paths or whatever, they tend to rate their experiences very high. Whereas when you're in a motorized vehicle, sometimes you often miss those specific experiences. And of course today, now that we're concerned in our country about the health of the nation, using people power has significant health benefits. Financial sustainability comes into play because when you compare bicycle and pedestrian modes to motorized modes, which require rolling stock, which have a definite life to them, so they do have a period of time over which they work and then they kind of end, that investment is pretty substantial, whereas the investment for bicycle and pedestrian networks is a lot less, and I'll highlight that in one of the sections coming up. And finally, because the footprint is smaller, there's a lot better ecological balance. So how many miles of bike paths do you have in your town or federal land? Do you have 0, greater than 1 or less than or equal to 10, between 10 and 20, 20 and 30, 30 and 40, or do you have none?
It looks like all the votes have been casted, so I'm going to close the poll and show the results.
All right, so it looks like we have some that have quite a bit and other ones that have very few. Going into section 1, we're going to talk about 2 sections of the document itself, the needs assessment and the partnerships. And as I mentioned earlier, Davis Farrer will be providing some input in addition in this section. The first section is needs assessment. Needs really can be identified within the unit or within the gateway community. And you'll hear a few times within this presentation when I talk about gateway communities. And gateway communities are essentially a community that is next to or basically is the entrance to a federal land unit. So locally here where I'm from in New Mexico, one that I can think of would be maybe the city of Aztec for Aztec Ruins National Monument, or probably a better known one would be Estes Park, which accesses on the east-hand side of Rocky Mountain National Park. But there are two ways that you can potentially use to identify needs. The first one is through workshops, such as shown here for the Cape Cod National Seashore. When they were developing their integrated bicycle feasibility study, they used these handouts to basically gain input from people during workshops. And in addition, you can use surveys. But surveys in this context are different than the surveys that we'll be discussing during the evaluation section, because here you're getting basically needs where people are identifying potential connections that they would like to see. And one thing I would like to note about the slides, which will kind of help you see where we are in the presentation, is if you look at the bottom right hand area here, we'll always have the particular section that we're talking about. So for surveys, to give you a little bit more specific examples, the Ridge to Rivers Pathway Plan, they had support for bicycle funding, and they had an estimate of the number of the users as a result of the surveys that they administered. And the North Moab Recreation Area, which you can find a discussion of this in TripTac's case study of this area, they identified a support for bicycle lane facilities. So these are two ways that you can use surveys to help identify needs. The second section that we've identified throughout reviewing other plans were partnerships. Partnerships can be defined as arrangements that are voluntary, mutually beneficial, and entered into for the purpose of mutually agreed upon objectives. Really, the benefits of partnerships that you see here are that you can accomplish a lot with a little. You get new ideas, opportunities, and solutions. It gives you a broader pool of expertise and other resources. It can potentially help identify a diversity of funding, and you can have support through grant applications. So as two examples, Moab Trails Alliance, or MTA, helps support the Grand County Non-Motorized Trails Master Plan by writing proposals for and helping to match funding for these particular grants. The Great Basin Institute helped with the development of the National Environmental Policy Act's documents, or NEPA documents, to support the implementation of the Lake Tahoe Region Bicycle and Pedestrian Plan. So those are two examples of really kind of the benefits of partnerships that come into play. As you consider who may want to partner, there's many different categories that you might want to consider, including other federal partners, state partners, local, nonprofit, friends groups, of course, Chamber of Commerce's and tourism agencies, and then really the park visitors and local citizens often have a lot of interest in being involved. And so here's just a few examples of partners for the Lake Tahoe Region Bicycle and Pedestrian Plan. As you can see, Caltrans, so that's the California Department of Transportation. The Forest Service was part of this plan because the lands were in this particular region, and the Washoe Tribe of Nevada and California. And in fact, for this particular plan, the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency was the one that actually developed. So those are just some examples, but I would encourage you to check out the document for a full listing. And now we're going to go into Davis Ferrer is going to tell us a little bit about how a memorandum of understanding was developed between the Red Hill Council and Bureau of Land Management to basically provide a more formalized agreement between these two entities for the partnership. Davis?
Yes. Okay. Well, we started off, I think if we could go to the next slide, I have an orientation slide here to give folks an idea about Red Hill. On the left is the map of our trail system. The Red Hill SRMA, Special Recreation Management Area, is about 3,000 acres. And you'll notice in the image on the lower portion, or the south side, there's a fairly high trail density, and that is the trail section closest to our access point. So if you look way down in the bottom, you can see the intersection of the highway and a red line representing the road. This area of Red Hill is used mostly by our user population, and we have about 55,000 user days per year, and most of the folks are using that southern area. On the northern half, or the upper section of our map, that's what we call the north side, and it's more remote, it's more difficult to get there, but it's a much more sort of wilderness experience, if you will. in that part of Red Hill. In the center of the image here, you can see where Carbondale and the Red Hill area is in relation to Denver, Grand Junction. It's kind of in the central portion of the state of Colorado. Below that, we have a graph of our user days, and this is from the period of 2001 to 2005. You can see the seasonality of our use. In the wintertime, it drops off, but you will note that over time, our winter use has increased because of the popularity of Red Hill. And there's a trend line, again, showing our use increasing over time, and it continues to increase. Below that bar graph is an area chart in purple showing the average round trips per day by month. And you'll note that in the May-June portion of the year, excuse me, our use peaks. And that's primarily because the trails on Red Hill melt off early. We're at high elevation. Red Hill is about 6,200 feet at the base and about 7,400 feet at the top. So our trails melt off, people can access them, whereas other trails in the area in the high country are still snow-covered or are very muddy and not very usable. So that just gives you an idea of what our user activity is by month. And then over in the upper right-hand side of the slide here is a picture of Red Hill from Carbondale. So you can see that it's a pretty dramatic feature. It's really an icon in the valley, and it's one of the most popular trail systems in the Roaring Fork Valley. Next slide. So in talking about partnerships, we work with BLM primarily. We started off as sort of an ad hoc citizens group, and we essentially got together. There were some informal trails on Red Hill that had been used by some folks that were hikers and very few bikers at that time. But as time went on, and also there was another user population, and that was the high school kids that on the weekends would sneak up there with a couple kegs of beer and have a bonfire and a woodsy, as we call them locally, which was a problem in terms of potential fire hazard. There was litter and trash and so on and so forth. And as our use increased, the kids found another place to go because obviously they don't want to be seen by the adult population. So why would we use an MOU? Well, at the time we started as an informal organization, we really didn't know anything about the BLM process, or for that matter, what we were getting into. But as we worked with BLM and had a better understanding of the BLM procedures, we became a little more sophisticated, and at one point, a gentleman named Francisco Mendoza, who was our BLM representative, brought us an MOU, basically an informal agreement that didn't have a whole lot of binding requirements, that kind of thing in it, but it simply said we are establishing a formal relationship between a citizens group and the BLM. And so we entered into that agreement. It renews periodically every few years. We have continued to renew it. Either group can opt out of the arrangement if they so chose, and there's nothing that really says that you're obligated to do certain things on either side. So that is the essential format of our MOU. In terms of options available to us, the other option that the BLM uses is something called an assistance agreement. And that form of arrangement between the two groups was not used because there was no transfer of money, property, or services, really anything of value. And that's the purpose of that type of agreement. So our MOU is really our primary way of formalizing our relationship and developing an understanding. And as the last bullet here points out, the MOU lays out the roles and responsibility of each of the involved groups. So that's essentially the basis of our formal relationship with BLM. Next slide. So this slide shows a picture of our first MOU signing party, and the bottles on the table are non-alcoholic champagne, so the BLM folks were covered on that one. But as I mentioned before, this was really a way to formalize our relationship. Part of the MOU, or what came out of the MOU, was an implementation plan that included a series of to-do tasks. And at this point, we've accomplished most of them. We probably need to work on updating that to-do task or implementation plan to make it more current and look at things that we're trying to accomplish in the future. As I mentioned before, it was really a way to formalize our relationship and solidify how we work together. And it wasn't intended to bind any of the parties in any kind of a negative way. So that's the essence of our formal relationship with the BLM. And in terms of partnerships as well, we work with the town of Carbondale, local government. We work with Garfield County, our parent county here in Colorado, on a variety of things. For example, we got a parking lot built. We do cleanups. We have the Department of Transportation that assists us with that. We also work with a series of volunteer organizations, and I'll talk about that a little later. But our success is really built upon partnerships with these other organizations and good, positive working relationships. Next slide. Okay.
All right, it looks like we're at our Q&A portion of the presentation, so if anyone has any questions for Davis or Natalie, you can use the Q&A drop-down manager to type in your question, and I will moderate it to one of our presenters. Or if you're using your telephone and you'd like to ask the presenter the question directly, you can press *8 on your telephone keypad. It does look like we have a couple of questions coming in, and the first one is for Davis. It indicates, what are the issues with Red Hills SRMA?
What are the issues? Well, that's kind of a broad question. I think some of the things that we have dealt with are conflicts with property owners. With our huge user population, there's a county road that you access for approximately a quarter of a mile to get to the trailhead. And folks will pull into the parking lot. They get out of the car and get their dogs out, get their gear on, and head up the road. And typically, when they go up the road, instead of, for example, walking single file on the appropriate side, they're oftentimes in the middle of the road with dogs on leashes all over the place. So there's a traffic conflict with the folks that live up there coming down the hill. That's probably one of our biggest areas of conflict. We have tried to work using education as a way to mitigate that problem, but it continues, and we are now working actually with the Paul Sarbanes grant to look at better access to Red Hill and hopefully an off-road access to the trailhead so that we eliminate that conflict. And that's probably our biggest issue. There are smaller things such as on the trails themselves, folks, once they get to the trailhead, they like to take their dogs off leash, and that creates some conflict with other folks that are on bicycles or don't have dogs. Not a big deal, but it's something that, again, through education, we try to address.
Thank you, Davis. That looks like it's it for the questions, so we're going to move to section 2.
Thank you, Amber. In this section, we're going to cover 4 additional of the 11 parts. And again, Davis will be sharing some input in these. The 4 parts that we'll be looking at are goals, objectives, and performance measures, bicycle and pedestrian network plan, design guidelines, and maintenance policy and procedures. So to begin with the goals, objectives, and performance measures, really this is kind of something that's carried throughout the plan. Goals will be general and brief. They will flow into objectives where you can have multiple objectives that are designed or identified for each goal. Objectives tend to be quantifiable, time-specific, and measurable. And then for each objective, you can also have multiple performance measures or really just one of each. And so shown here is a specific example taken from the Lake Tahoe Region Bicycle and Pedestrian Plan, where you can see their goal, which is a complete bicycle and pedestrian network that provides convenient access to basin destinations and destinations outside the basin. And it's very general, it's short, just one sentence, and that flows into the objective, which you can see there's, the type specific of the implement 20% or approximately 45 miles of all recommended facility improvements within 5 years. So they have that 2015 goal, the actual mileage that they want to do, and then that can feed into the performance measures, which then kind of tells you which data you want to collect. So these can be identified throughout for, more generally, or they can be specific to programs that you develop, which we'll talk about in a little bit here yet. The section then after that we identified was the Bicycle and Pedestrian Network Plan. A bicycle and pedestrian network plan can be just specific to a federal land unit, or if there's a gateway community, it can be brought in to include the gateway community, which is desirable, and then even better yet, to look at the larger transportation network and see how this can all be sewn together to really make it an efficient network. Again, the gateway community is the one that's, the neighboring the federal land unit. Through reviewing the plans that we saw, we identified 4 different steps: identifying projects, identify rating criteria, and assign criteria weights, to choose the ranking scale and rank projects, and to finally summarize results and develop a network map or maps. So a federal land manager can use these steps or they can modify. These are just kind of recommendations we've seen from other plans. So identifying projects, really that particular kind of step where you're going to look at missing links or expanding the network as a whole is done essentially in the needs assessment. So that will flow into this particular section. And then you go into the rating criteria and assign criteria weights. For this particular example, you can see here in Acadia National Park, they developed a hike and trails management plan. They used a scale from 0 to, well, they identify the different criteria, the 4 which are shown here: the cultural resource values, effects on natural resources, effects on communities and neighbors, and visitor experience values. And then they assign the criteria weights. I was getting ahead of myself. The criteria weights you can see here, the most important ones are those 2 first listed sources, which have the values of 5, and then the other ones have lower values. And it looks like they took just kind of a range of 1 to 5, because if you think that they're essentially going to act as multipliers, which we'll show here in these next slides, where you can see for one specific project, they looked at those 4 different criterions, and they identified with a rating scale. In this particular case, they chose 0 to 10, so they had a 7 that came out for each of these specific ones for this specific project, which can be done through workshops or through potentially surveys, but more likely through workshops. They multiplied it by the weight, and they got their weighted rating. And then from that, they summed all of them to get the actual score for this particular project. And then the next step, they went, and again, this is the project that we just looked at, and you can see these are the weighted rating for each of the particular criteria, and they have the total score. And then this is just an abbreviated list of all the different projects they identified, but you can see that it's listed above some of the other ones. But one thing to note is that even though this one's listed above, say, the Beach Cliff Ladder Trail, if there's a particular project that's going on that would make implementing the Beach Cliff Ladder Trail prior to the other one that's rated above it, you'd want to do that one first. So that's something to keep in mind. The next section associated that we identified were the design guidelines. There's been recent documents that just came out. The 2 that you see here on the left-hand side, the Guide for Development of Bicycle Facilities, came out by the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, or AASHTO if you've heard of that. And the National Association of City Transportation Officials just came out with the Urban Bikeway Design Guide. And while it is urban and many of the federal land units are in more rural areas, a lot of the information can be applied to rural areas. So it's worth checking out. They have some great webinars that were done in these, which go into detail about them. And then, of course, the manual and uniform traffic control devices, or MUTCD, is a great source for designs associated with bicycles and pedestrians. And then the National Park Service's Guide to Sustainable Mountain Trails is another resource you might want to consult. And we did not specifically identify design guidelines in our document itself because of the fact that they're often updated and changing as we learn more information, as I said, because you can tell by the recent developments by those other two documents. The six components that we identified were maintenance policy and procedures. I love this quote taken from the 2008 Grand County Non-Motorized Trails Master Plan, where they said a non-maintained trail system is worse than no trail system at all. So they're really focusing in on the fact that if you have a trail system and it's in a state of disrepair, people won't want to use it, and so then you might have the other people going, well, we have these facilities, why aren't people using it? Well, it's really important to maintain it so you do have that continued use. And so you want to look at the different types of maintenance, including short-term activities such as trash removal and long-term activities such as seal coating. And the document itself identifies other lists, so you might want to consult that as well. But you'll also have to consider that different regions will need different maintenance activities. So if you have snow in the region, of course, you're going to want to consider snow removal. And then also the use, so the frequency of use will dictate how often maintenance needs to be performed. A big part of maintenance that is often kind of a barrier is funding, but there's creative ways that you can address funding options. The Jackson Hole developed an Adopt a Trail partnership where individuals or organizations are able to donate time and money. So it's really kind of a non-funding requirement from their perspective. And then one of the examples that's been copied by other ones is called the Acadia Trails Forever program. And in a nutshell, really what they did is they had some federal dollars that were then matched by their friends group. And then this money is put into an endowment. And so every year, based on the amount that's earned from interest, they are able to do trail maintenance. So it fluctuates, which is kind of a negative, but at the same point in time, is still a dedicated funding source for maintenance. And it's been so successful that other parks like Cuyahoga Valley National Park, the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, and Great Smoky Mountains National Park have taken this model as well. And then one other example would be the Red Hill volunteer trail maintenance work parties. And Davis, again, will be discussing this a little bit in more detail. So Davis, would you like to explain a little bit more?
Sure. If I could have the next slide, please. Part of Red Hill's success is based upon volunteer participation. In this picture, you can see some kids that were from an alternative high school. This was initial trail construction. These kids were involved. It was probably the first time they'd ever worked on a trail, certainly in a remote, semi-wilderness environment. And, they were pretty excited about doing the work. It was hard work, so that was probably a little bit new for them, but it was a very positive first experience. And that kind of experience out in the woods really builds ownership and pride in the result. So I'm going to guess that these kids have come back here. They probably, if they're with their friends, they can point out what the work that they did on the trail, and the section that they worked on was a very difficult one. So that sort of builds that positive experience. The Red Hill Council works with a variety of schools in the area, the Colorado Rocky Mountain School. We work with a trails organization in the valley called Roaring Fork Outdoor Volunteers. There's another school called the Carbondale Community School. And we've used all of these organizations to help us do things like clean up the parking lot, do roadside cleanup, work on trail maintenance, build new trails, and install things like waysides along our trail system. So the value of volunteer work parties is it really does build community ownership in the system. In fact, there is so much ownership in the Red Hill Trail system that I'm a mountain biker, and I know other mountain bikers, when you're riding a challenging section of trail, if there's a particular rock, you get a little reward about making it over that rock or around a technical section. And, other newer users to the area, for example, might go up and pull a rock out that that local folks have been riding over and sort of challenging themselves with. And we often hear back from some of the more advanced bikers with complaints about, hey, who's removing the rocks? Don't change the trail. So that's one of our challenges on our system, is there's so much ownership that if anything changes, people complain about it. But we work around that, and that's not so much a negative thing. Volunteers are important for getting our projects completed. We've built almost 20 miles of trails in the Red Hill area, and it's all a result of volunteer efforts. As I mentioned before, we partner with a variety of groups in the area, and that's a critical piece. It's a learning experience for everybody who's up there. A lot of people that volunteer for trail crews have never done it before and simply want to give something back to the community. So they gain from that, and so does the whole trail system. It's a little frustrating at times to see the number of users on the trail, and then when you go out for a trail work day and solicit volunteers, the response rate is considerably lower than what you see in terms of the user population. But I don't think that's out of the ordinary. It's something that other organizations experience. And again, as folks are up there working on the trail and people are coming by, there's often a guilt factor there, and people will say, gosh, I'd love to help you. I can't do it today because I've got to rearrange my sock drawer. But they will come back, hopefully, and give back a little bit to the trail system because they benefit by using it. It's important with volunteer groups and trail projects to plan in advance, get notice out, let people know that something's going to be happening even a month ahead of time. But immediately prior to the event, maybe a week and even just a few days prior, saturate the local media, the local radio stations, and the newspapers with information about the trail day and how people can sign up and volunteer, because many people make their decision at the last minute, and if they don't remember, they won't sign up. Most importantly, all volunteer work party events should be fun. They need to be well supervised. Safety of the work crews is paramount. We talk about how to carry tools. We make sure that, you know, if you're using a Pulaski, you're not swinging it over your head with somebody right behind you. We talk about making sure when you're moving rocks that your fingers aren't between the rocks and those kinds of things. You know, you do get small injuries, pinched fingers, cuts, but nothing too serious, hopefully, that where somebody requires, you know, immediate medical attention. And then what we typically do at the end of the workday is we have food, pizza, and other kinds of food, and typically some good beer. We like microbrews, so you get good food, good drink, opportunity to interact with the other people that worked that day, share stories, and then it's also a good time when you have a captive audience to talk about other projects you have coming down the pike and when they're going to be and how you can sign up for them. So again, volunteer work crews and volunteer participation are critical to the success of our organization, and they really are an important piece in building that ownership.
Great, thank you, Davis. If there are any questions at this point, if you can use your Q&A drop-down manager to type in your question, or if you're joining us via the telephone and you'd like to ask the question directly of the presenter, you can just press *8 on your telephone keypad. It looks like we have one question so far, and Davis, it's for you. Do you place signs at the trailheads prior to or during volunteer days?
Yes, we do. We will put signs up usually a week ahead of time, indicating the date of the event and how people can sign up.
Great. It does not look like there are any questions, any other questions, so we will move on to section 3.
Thank you, Amber. In this section, we'll cover 3 additional parts of the 11 total components, and please stay tuned because Dan Dressler will be talking about tours under the Encouragement, Education, Enforcement Programs section. So section 7 talks about bicycle and pedestrian support elements. These elements are really used to promote use of the facilities themselves. It includes wayfinding, which is the sign here you can see on your left-hand side, which is taken from Rocky Mountain National Park. Wayfinding helps to promote positive visitor experience, and they're particularly critical at junction points. And as you can see by the sign shown in the photo, they can be context sensitive, so they don't have to really negatively impact, the viewscape itself. In the middle is an example of bicycle parking. We need to provide adequate bicycle parking to encourage use. And one thing to note is you'll see that they're inverted U-shaped bicycle locks or bars themselves, and that's so that you can lock the bike up in two parts, because unfortunately that's definitely a need sometimes. And then here in the bottom right is an example of integrating transit with bicycling and pedestrians. Of course, in this particular place, it's showing the ability to store the bicycles on the train themselves, because Cuyahoga Valley offers a bike aboard program, which really is where you can take their towpath trail in one direction, and then you can take the train going back in the other direction. So it provides a really nice integration between the two different modes. The next section is cost and funding analysis. Really, when you consider the cost of bicycle and pedestrian trails, as I mentioned at the beginning, consider, for example, that the city of Portland integrated an entire citywide bicycle network for less than the cost of 1 mile of urban freeway. I mean, really just consider that. How far is 1 mile? Most of us, I think, maybe could run or walk a mile. You can consider that investment resulted in an entire network. So really, you get a lot out of your money and investment. But the level of investment will depend on the type of facilities that you implement. So you can have the most basic, which are the bicycle routes, where you only need signs and pavement markings. The intermediate kind of investment would be the bicycle lanes. And the cost can be increased on this if you need to move curb and gutter. It's not necessarily always the case, so it could be kind of similar in cost to bicycle routes themselves. And the most expensive one tends to be the sidewalks and multi-use paths. However, a significant benefit of this particular level of investment is that you get a lot more variety of users. You can see here on the right, this is again from Grand Teton National Park, where they have a multi-use path shown here. And a lot of times, women and children can be found in this, and women are actually shown to be indicators of kind of the perceived safety in a bicycle network. And then finally, when you consider cost and funding, you want to be prepared with a cost estimate. And this is a really important thing, especially now in times where there's lots of changes going on with the funding mechanisms, so that you can take advantage of any opportunities that you see for funding. Because if you can be like, yeah, I have this pathway that I want to make, and it's going to cost this, and then you might be able to come up with a solution as a result of that. So being prepared is very useful. And ways you can look at identifying potential sources are to look at other plans, particularly those that are in close geography, because a lot of times, for example, California has additional funding for bicycle and pedestrian systems that other states typically don't. So if you're in California, you'd want to look at a specific bicycle and pedestrian plan in that area. And the same could be said, maybe there's other kind of uniqueness within states. So that's something to consider. A lot of times, though, state funding might be overlooked, so you'll want to consider to work with state representatives. And this goes back into the beginning where we talked about potential partners. And engaging your state DOT representatives is a good way to do that. But you also don't want to overlook local sources. Funding can be leveraged from them as well. And of course, nonprofit and even private options are different ones that you don't want to miss considering. The next section is encouragement, education, and enforcement programs. You want to encourage use. For example, as I've kind of highlighted, and we'll have shortly a discussion on in the next few slides, will be tours, because they help introduce non-motorized facilities that people might not otherwise be aware of. So it's a great way to really kind of expand the knowledge, because a lot of times you'll see people learn about things through conversation with other people. You'll want to educate all users, not just the motorists, but also bicycle users, pedestrians, if you have equestrian use, kind of the different combinations of use. And then you also want to enforce the rules, because unfortunately, it's maybe people don't necessarily know the rules, and a lot of times the enforcement can take on more of an educational kind of perspective. So as I indicated, Dan Dressler is going to talk about a tour up in Mississippi National River and Recreation Area in the Minneapolis area. So Dan, if you'd like to take it away.
Hi, I'm Dan Dressler, and I'm a supervisory interpretive park ranger here at Mississippi National River and Recreation Area. And for the record, I'm located in St. Paul, not Minneapolis, so that is part of the park. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our Bike with a Ranger program. We started this program back in 2005, and to really understand the program, though, I have to give you just a very brief tour of the park, because it's essential to understanding how the program came about and how we run it and why we run it like we do. So first off, there's our pretty picture. That is Minneapolis in the photo there. But there's just shy of 54,000 acres inside our park boundaries, and we own all of 64 of those. We are a partnership park, and the 54,000 acres stretches along 72 river miles as it passes through the Twin Cities metropolitan area. So it's a very long, narrow corridor of a park that snakes around and following the river course through the area. And within that, we have wild backwater areas, as you can see there in the picture, that are floodplains. They're much more scattered out toward the ends of the park. We also have the two major urban areas that are 15 river miles apart, which is downtown Minneapolis there, where you can see St. Anthony Falls, and downtown St. Paul. And then we also have historic sites that are scattered along the river, like Fort Snelling. And all these sites, there's much public land scattered throughout the 54,000 acres that are managed by local and state park agencies. And it's complicated. We have 5 counties that we cross, and there's about 25 communities that our boundaries overlap with. And so what we found is that each community, each county, and sometimes the state, and occasionally even the different agencies within the federal government have their own little tiny slices of riverfront. And especially between Minneapolis and St. Paul, there's an excellent system of trails. But it's not terribly integrated because St. Paul only maintains their stretch, and once you cross over, it might connect to Dakota County's stretch of trails, but they've done something entirely different. And so with our Bike with a Ranger program, we found we were the only agency that was interested in looking beyond just their little stretch of river. And so nobody was doing anything remotely similar in the Twin Cities metro area. And we took this idea that we were going to cross all these jurisdictional boundaries, give people a great introduction of just how well integrated these trails were, because that information wasn't easily accessible, and also talk about the national significance of the Mississippi River right here in the Twin Cities. So a few facts and figures here about our Bike with a Ranger program. Started in 2005. We've had over 110 rides, over 1,000 visitors on those rides. You figure that out per person. It's actually not that high of a number, but I'll circle back to that. Right now, we have 4 different routes that we do. We usually go on Saturdays, starting in mid-June and through the end of September. We just say every Saturday, and we circle through those 4 routes. So we, 1 month, we'll circle back to the same set of routes and just keep repeating them throughout the course of the summer. The routes vary from 9 to 14 miles in length. We limit the riders for 20 participants per rider, and we found that that's just the kind of the maximum size of group that one ranger can really successfully lead on the trails and have a good experience and keep the group somewhat together. We do have a registration process. Though there's no charge for it, we ask people to call our visitor center. This year we actually set up an online system so that people can register ahead of time. We try to send 2 staff and or volunteers per ride. It's nice to have somebody out, in a park ranger who's doing the interpretation out in lead, and then either another staff person, and usually that staff person is somebody who we're training to do the program, or we get a volunteer to ride sweep just to help with any tricky turns that we might have if the group gets stretched out, and also to just help out anybody in the back who might be having mechanical issues or just have trouble keeping up. It's really, in the grand scheme of things, a fairly low-cost program to operate. You know, there is a training element to it, but other than that, since we do the same routes over and over again, it's fairly easy for the ranger to show up that morning of and grab what they need and go and run the program. So there's very, in the grand scheme of things, we do a lot at the beginning of the summer to set up the program, but after that, the program kind of runs itself, and the ranger just has to show up and do the actual presentation. A few other notes here. Our visitation is heavily drawn from our local community. Twin Cities metropolitan area is just a little bit shy of 3 million people, so we have, you know, no difficulties rounding up locals. And we've also just found that as much as we'd like to get tourists to the area to come on our rides, they're, you know, it's just not happening. They're not showing up. The bike availability is a huge issue, and so locals are our bread and butter audience, so it's not a problem to encourage them to use their own bikes. We've dabbled in figuring out loaner bikes over the years, and we do have a few that are available, but if you're thinking about setting up this program, you know, feel free to get in touch with me or ask me more questions, and I can tell you all about our trials and tribulations with loaner bikes. And it's just challenging, right? When somebody signs up and they want a loaner bike, then we have to start asking them questions like, how tall are they? So that when the ranger that morning is collecting bikes and bringing them to our start spot, they have an idea of which bike to bring for them. The one thing we've done, though, that helps address this whole loaner bike issue, because it does help, is we have 50 bikes that we share with one of the local Boy Scout chapters, and they own a building that's very close that is the starting spot for one of our 4 routes, and so they keep the bikes in there, and our agreement with them is they will let us into the building and use those bikes. So there's once a month, in essence, there's a ride where we can take, you know, 20 people who don't have a bike. They're not the greatest bikes in the world, but they do work, and we can get them out there on that. So that is one of the ways we've dealt with this. We ask them to wear helmets, and again, as I mentioned already, we ask them to pre-register for trips. Not only does the pre-registration help us limit our group size to 20 riders, but it also gives us an opportunity to communicate with the riders in advance. Once somebody registers by calling the visitor center or signing up online, then we send them a follow-up email and with a letter that describes really what they need to know more in depth about where the meeting spot is, and I believe that is available for download as one of the handouts. And it's just been very helpful to have that letter sent to them in advance. So, helpful considerations. Again, I know I already talked about it, but loaner bikes are a nightmare. You know, that is a problem with running this program, is how you're going to actually get bikes to people who don't have them. But you know, we figured it out, and I think we're actually in a pretty good spot right now. Good publicity is a must for this program. You know, before I worked here at this park, I was working at many more traditional national parks where it was actually fairly easy to get visitors to show up for park ranger programs because they expected them. They were staying in the campground, whatever it was. But here in this large metropolitan area where there's a lot going on, it's sometimes hard to get your brand out there in front of the public and get them interested in what you're doing. But a couple of times when we've gotten some whole metro area-wide media attention, instantly the rest of our programs for that year tend to fill up. And so we now try to make a heavy push at the beginning of the summer to get some media outlet to cover our program, and then our registration goes way up. We're not successful every year, and those are years when our registration is definitely a little bit lower. Although we have found that since we do offer 4 different routes, that the real key is to get someone to come out to one, because once they come out to one, we have a high number of people who, after their first Bike with a Ranger trip, will come back and register for more trips in that summer that are on the different routes. So different routes not only spread us geographically, but it also gets repeat visitors. Hardcore bikers are not interested in interpretive ride, and I apologize to anybody who gets their hackles up about that statement. We, early on in our program, got a lot of feedback when we had several employees who would describe themselves as hardcore bikers, that they wanted to do interpretive rides, but they wanted to have a more challenging ride than our very family-friendly slow pace. And so we tried that out, and what we found is that if hardcore bikers are really interested in interpretive rides, they're just happy to come along on the family-friendly rides, that we couldn't beg, borrow, and steal people to register for our more difficult, challenging rides that still had an interpretive component to it. And so what we ended up is the few people who did show up really weren't up to the harder, more challenging route, and they were interested in the interpretive ride. So they're family friendly, they're easy, anybody can come along kind of rides is where we found a real sweet spot is. You really do need 2 staff though. That having that sweet person is so helpful. Lots of different levels, not just is keeping people on track in some spots where there are tricky turns to stay on route. And also then when, occasionally when we have people with serious mechanical problems, we had somebody already designated to handle that. We have gotten more serious in recent years about training our staff and volunteers, and now we have 2 people on staff here, 2 park rangers who have gone to the League of American Bicyclists training. And so at the beginning of the summer, we hold a refresher. If we have a bunch of new people involved, we hold a full-on course so that our riders, our staff people are good at riding bikes. The vast majority of our rides are almost all on trail. There's very little on-road part. But we've just found by sending folks through that training that they're more comfortable, competent riders that are better at giving instructions to participants. Don't assume people know how to bike. We've done a lot of these programs now, not on our typical Saturday, but as special programs for a couple of community centers. We work with one in St. Paul and one in Minneapolis. And these community centers are definitely serving low-income neighborhoods. And both of them have a lot of the kids that are coming there are coming from immigrant communities. And at first we just handed a bike to them and said, here, ride this bike around. And it didn't always go well. So now we have separated those 2 groups entirely. We still work with those groups. We still do biking. But we don't blend the general public into our community center groups, because when we go with those community center groups, the very first thing we do is here's how the brakes work, here's how to turn, and just basic right around the parking lot, simple stuff, so once we actually hit the trail, we have far fewer problems. Have a clear weather policy. This happens every year. We cancel multiple rides, or people cancel themselves just because it's raining. We schedule our programs to start at 10 o'clock in the morning, hopefully not only to beat the heat of the day, but also hopefully to get out in front of when thunderstorms are more likely to happen. But we do have a park-owned cell phone that we give to the Bike with a Ranger program every summer, and we publish that phone number in our letter, and we ask the rangers to turn it on in the morning as soon as they start their shift. So if there are weather questions, that participants can call in and see how the ranger is feeling about it. But really we try to go unless it's raining heavily and or there's lightning. Just a little bit of drizzle. If the participants want to go, we try to go, although even a little bit of drizzle, we find lots of times they cancel. But that's also nice with the cell phone is when they cancel, they can call you and tell you that they're canceling so that you're not standing around a parking lot wondering whether that group is coming or not. We've played around a lot with routes over the years, but the 4 routes we choose give us a little bit of geographic diversity in where we go, and we've found that kind of shooting for a 10-mile loop is what people really like, and so that's why we have the 4 routes we have. Starting locations has given us a lot of headaches over the years because you've got to find a spot where people can drive to, because we found most participants do throw their bikes in on the car, drive to the starting spot. So you have to have a starting spot that on a Saturday morning people can park for free and can easily find a parking spot. So some of our starting locations are, occasionally like in a school parking lot that's a couple blocks from the river. So, but do consider those very carefully when you're figuring out how to do your program. So it's been a great program over the years. We continue to do it year after year. The staff likes doing it. Again, as I said before, we get a lot of repeat customers with visitors signing up for multiple routes over and over again, and it just has really, people have really enjoyed not only the interpretive aspect, but also getting an orientation to how a fairly complicated bike and network ties together within these Twin Cities communities. So anybody have any questions?
Great, thank you, Dan. So if there are any questions, you can type them in the Q&A drop-down manager, or if you're joining us via the telephone, you can press *8 on your telephone keypad. I also wanted to remind folks that Dan had mentioned the ride letter, and that is in the handouts section of the live meeting today. There's 3 white pieces of paper icon on the top right-hand corner of your screen. And I also just wanted to give everyone a quick reminder that the next section will include our desktop exercise. That includes the video. So if you'll download that to your desktop, that will certainly help with the next section as well. And Dan, it looks like we have one question for you, and that is, how long does it take to develop a route?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. We've, in the last, I think the last 2 years now, we've had the same routes, and again, for lots of different reasons, they work for us. Earlier on, we were experimenting much more widely with routes, but the last couple of new routes we've developed, we've found that it's really fairly easy to develop a new route because we like to do loops and there's a limited number of bridges, so that in and of itself is a limiting factor to get the appropriate distance that fits within the time frame we're working on. And the winning thing is we have a couple of vague ideas in mind, and then we have just solicited for one of our volunteers to go out and do a little bit of ground truthing kind of within the idea or within the area that we've already identified. We've asked the volunteer to go out, measure some distances, measure some time, note very good spots to stop for interpretation to happen, and then they come back with their notes. We look it over, and then we usually send one staff person back out with that same volunteer to try it again and see what they think about that. And once you have the route and stops established, then it just takes one of the interpreters a little bit of time to come up with the interpretive content for that route. So if you want to put an actual staff time number on it, 3 days or less, and that includes interpretive research. If you add the volunteer hours in, then it probably throw in a 4th day because it's something they can do in a day. So it's been fairly easy for us to develop new routes.
And the next question, who maintains the trails on the MPS portion?
That is, we actually don't own any of the trails. I always say, being part of a partnership park, that since we really don't own any facilities, it's the beauty and the terrible part about being a partnership all at once. So it really is a multitude of different municipalities and their parks department. I can think about one particular ride. We start in St. Paul, so we're on St. Paul Park and Rec Trail. We eventually cross over into Dakota County land. So Dakota County is maintaining that along with some of the municipalities, including Mendota inside Dakota County. And then we cross back over a state highway bridge into Fort Snelling Historic Site maintained by the Minnesota Historical Society, and then we cross into Fort Snelling State Park maintained by the Minnesota DNR, and then we cross into the city of Minneapolis maintained by Minneapolis Park and Rec Board before crossing back into St. Paul. So that's who's maintaining those different stretches of trails, which again is one of the reasons why to this day no other organization in the Twin Cities is doing anything similar to Bike with a Ranger, just because nobody's able to look beyond their jurisdictional boundaries quite as far as we are.
Great. And our last question, you had mentioned some of your thoughts about the bike lending program that you guys have and some of the drawbacks. Somebody had wondered if you'd considered using a bike sharing program instead.
Yes, actually, 2 years ago now, a bike sharing program opened up in the Twin Cities called Nice Rides Minnesota. And, similar to the other bike sharing programs that are happening around the country and world. And so far, we have not pursued that very hard because of some of the logistical challenges. We've done a couple experimental rides with it, but the way in which the charges for the bikes are doled out, it's been too hard. And what we've decided is that if we're going to do that in the future, and it's still on the table, we just don't quite know how to handle it, that we will have to run that as a completely separate Bike with a Ranger program because of needing to return the bikes within the time period, and it's the logistics on how the bike share program works. We'd either have to deal with an official partnership with Nice Rides Minnesota to get an exemption from the charges, or work within the half-hour time limit to not accrue larger charges, and sometimes the stations just aren't in the right spot. So it's out there, we're thinking about it, but so far it's been too hard.
Great. Thank you, Dan. It looks like that's all the questions for now, so we'll move on to the education portion of today's presentation.
Thank you, Amber. Really, education, one thing to consider is that it's not just for motorists. It's between all of the different non-motorized modes as well and motorists. So it's one thing to keep in mind. And one of the things, too, as Dan discussed, is that really we can't overlook the fact that not everybody knows how to ride a bicycle. So a lot of times education is really having programs to educate users how to ride bicycles. Bicycle rodeos are one of the most popular ways to do so. And education can also be teaching the users how to interact. And so here I want you guys to check out a Ridge to Rivers. They have a partnership up there in Boise, Idaho, and there's a YouTube video that they've developed to kind of show how users should interact to use the facilities. So Amber will discuss a little bit more about how to access that.
Yes, this is now the portion of the presentation where we want to do our desktop exercise. So if you have not already done so, you'll go to the handout section of Live Meeting and download the video to your desktop. There'll be a few moments now of silence, and when you're done watching the video, if you will come back to Live Meeting and let us know that you've finished watching the video, that would be great. Enjoy the video. All right, it looks like most folks are done watching the video, so we will continue.
So I hope you guys enjoyed that video. It's a great way to kind of show an innovative manner in which you can kind of convey the information of how to educate users about, the different uses and how to interact. So next we'll go on to bicycle enforcement programs. When we are looking through different programs, we found that there were some bicycle enforcement programs. Of course, the benefit of them is that you have reductions in fuel consumption and emissions because you are using people power instead of motorized vehicles. And here on the right, you'll see a photo taken from Lake Clark National Park and Preserve up in Alaska, where they can now access the different islands within the actual unit itself, and they do so by biking on them, but using the rafts to take the bikes between the different things. So the raft will then fold up once they get to the thing. They store that on the bike when they go around and do their enforcement or basically just check out the area, and then they can then head on to the next one when they're done. So it's a kind of interesting way. It's pretty specific to Lake Clark, but I'm sure you can imagine that there's maybe ways that other units could apply such innovative patrols. And other areas that have bicycle enforcement programs would be Cape Cod National Seashore, Independence National Historical Park, and Valley Forge National Historical Park. The image shown here on the right is a training program that they did for the officers that are providing enforcement in these particular areas. So which of the following programs has your unit or that which you are affiliated with initiated? Do you have some encouragement programs like the tours that Dan talked about? Do you have any education programs such as the bike rodeo or maybe kind of a video similar to that? Or maybe do you have enforcement by bicycles? Or if you have none, that's just fine as well. Hopefully you'll get some ideas from what we've seen here today.
Natalie, it looks like everyone has cast a vote, so I'm going to close the poll and show the results.
Okay, great. It looks like we have some examples that are out there, and there's also a few people that don't have any, but that kind of leads into the next slide. If you do have examples that you'd be willing to share with us, please send me an email and share with them if you'd be so willing. We'd love to learn more about the ones that we focus in the actual document, or just so we've learned that. We know there's some other ones out there. And if you haven't, we'd encourage you to consider some of these today in your particular unit as well. In the final section that we'll be getting into, there's two last components, evaluating and monitoring and plan updates. Both Davis Farrar will be providing a little bit of input as well, and we'll have a great presentation from Charles Borders specific to the Mount Vernon Trail and a little bit on Rock Creek Park as well. So evaluating and monitoring, we really help to assess the effectiveness of plans, projects, and programs. If you're familiar with MAP 21 and what's come out, you know, this is kind of the data portion of it that helps determine whether or not our plan is effective thus far. So it feeds back into those goals, objectives, and performance measures that we talked about early on. And really the information gleaned here will help to benefit plan updates and future projects. And without further ado, Charles Borders, I will hand it off to you to discuss more about Mount Vernon Trail and Rock Creek Park. Charles?
Well, thank you very much. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how the National Capital Region has developed a program on evaluating, monitoring bicycle and safety pedestrians in the multimodal trails throughout the region, but specifically looking at some of the data and techniques that we've used to gather this data on Mount Vernon Trail, and then look at the some specific data on Rock Creek. Next slide, please. So if we want to actually go ahead to the next one. So we've got a case study on Mount Vernon Trail. We're going to present some results and outcomes and recommendations for the ways to collect the data, and then how we have used this data to identify specific projects and move some projects forward. So next slide, please. So here we're talking about a little bit of the methods of counting the traffic on the Mount Vernon Trail. We have the diamond counter system, which is a little bit of the older style, and it doesn't differentiate between the type of user. It just gives you straight numbers like a vehicle counter may, a loop counter on the road. What we've tried to use in working with other municipalities and tying it into a regional system is the one shown on the lower left, in the eco counters. And this has a loop that is in the trail pavement as well as an eye that is fixed to the pole. And you see in the little corner down here, let's see if the pointer it works here. You see there's a little hand box that ties everything together. This is operated by batteries. It does take a little bit of maintenance to keep it going. So if you look at the chart here on the right, in the modes you get from the manual count validation, you can see that you can then break down the types of users, the male cyclists versus female cyclists, and the pedestrians, and you can see how your trail is being used. Next slide, please. So some pros and cons of electronic counting. So the big benefits are that you can tie this into high density areas, and in this particular case we have tied it in and working in conjunction with Arlington County. It gives you data 24/7 every day. You don't, it's always out there, it's always working for you, and it gives you that breakdown. It gives you the ability to capture the data in more than one location. You can key on high concentration areas or areas of study that you might want to learn a little bit more about, and then it gives you the dynamometer data and the location data as well. Some of the downsides are it can't distinguish between the gender, age, or the type of user as far as a mechanical device, bike or a stroller, and as far as other examples go. The battery life, and they are a little bit expensive, so it is going to take a little bit of monitoring to keep up, to make sure that they're operating properly. Next slide, please. So manual counting is utilizing your volunteers. You can get that demographic data to see how your trail is actually being used, and you can discern the types of users and the patterns, and it also validates the electronic counts to really highlight and give you a perception of what is going on the trail, how it's being used. The cons, some of the downside, it takes significantly more time. Utilizing the volunteers is a great way to offset this as far as the park staff or you're using your staff. You've got to pick some windows of time that you want to concentrate on when you're going to do the manual counts. And just like you might do on a transportation traffic study, you can extrapolate that over the course of a week and a month and a year. Next slide. So some of the recommendations as far as capturing the data in the counting, you can really learn a lot from spending a couple hours out there watching the trail and seeing how it is being used. Trail counters use an automated system, the eco counters. It gives you that consistency, and then in some cases you can tie that into a regional count system, like I mentioned with Arlington County, and looking at how we're going to tie that into the District of Columbia. Manual counts, we try to do it regularly, a couple times a year. It gives you that validation. If you have an opportunity to maybe get smaller windows of time and in different locations, anything that can help. The website that's shown on here, Bike Fed Document, it gives guidelines and clearing. It's a kind of a clearinghouse for all the data nationwide, so you can profile your use and compare that to other systems in the country. Next slide, please. Now we're going to get into a little bit of the specifics in presenting the how that data is captured in incorporation between the electronic counting and the manual validation. So as you can see from this chart up here, this is an hourly traffic profile on a workday. And the unique thing that happens on Mount Vernon Trail is that we have a rush hour. As you can see, you've got a peak in the morning, and you have a peak in the afternoon from mainly the bicyclist. But then you compare that with the red line and the blue line through the course of the day, you can see that the runners and the walkers, they tend to come out more in the evening or after work. So, and then if you break that down and compare it to the weekend, the runners who might tend to, on the weekend, using it for longer runs or training runs, you get the triathlons, that type of user, you know, they're out in the morning, whereas the bicyclists come out in the afternoon. And if you look at this, we're looking right here at a peak use at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We've got about 450 trips that pass through this location, you know, in within an hour's time. I would say that's congestion. You have congestion on your trail. Then you also see on the weekend, you see a lull at lunch versus a spike. There we go, a spike at lunch during the weekday. So you really get the dynamics of how the trail is being used. And I keep using that phrase over and over again, but nothing, you know, nothing can replace the actual data and, like I said, the validation of the use versus the perception of the use of the trail. So, you know, you're looking at an average daily count here of, you know, an average 2,600, you know, through this location, and then, you know, on the versus a weekend, you're getting, you know, 42, almost 4,300 combined trips through this location. So there's definitely congestion that has to be dealt with through the nodes. Next slide, please. So then you can take that and you can extrapolate that into an annual month-by-month chart. So just to orient everybody here, the District of Columbia is up here. The National Airport is right here. Virginia's on the left side, and this is the District of Columbia in Maryland over here. So we have 18 miles of trail in the Mount Vernon Trail, you know, but you look at through a peak area right here, and, you know, we're getting 85,000, 84,000 trips at the Dangerfield Island area, which is right here, which is centrally located. It's got a lot of connections to the neighborhoods with bridges under the parkway, tunnels, access points. So it's kind of a convergence of people passing through north to south or making a loop. So you can really identify where those areas are. And then you look at the totals in that one area, you know, through a year, 700,000 trips through that one node. Some of those are passing through, some are up and back, and some, like I said, might be a loop. But you know, you compare that to a roadway system. If you had a roadway with 700,000 trips, you know, in a year, that would be a pretty high use. So managing that throughout the course of the year and even into the winter months, it creates problems and situations that have to be dealt with for maintenance and for you know, visitor use. Next slide, please. So we have had an opportunity out there to do a little bit of speed data as far as education and, you know, making bicyclists aware of actually how fast they're going. You get a lot of the we'll call them the hardcore bicyclists, and they want to roll through there at, you know, 16, 20 miles an hour, but you put them on the trail at you know, 4,000 trips through a node with, you know, somebody that's got the carriage and then the kids with the strollers. You're going to end up with some conflicts because there are differing use patterns and different mindset on how the trail can be used. So really working with the users to understand each other's perspective in some trail courtesy. Next slide, please. So how we've taken all that data that we have, it's 700,000 trips a day, and you identify that with the accident data, and you can break that down to the nodes and see consistencies where accidents are happening. So, you know, you can look at mile 12, we've got an S-curve, and then in the situation that's shown here on this slide where the trail loops down adjacent to the parkway and back up, you know, you can get into some conflicts on a blind curve as well as some traction issues. But then you use this data to justify and identify, and you can see here that you have, you know, you classify those accidents from the accident report, and there we go, you know, bike-on-bike accident, you know, or, you know, the bicycle only where it was an error on their part, and then what the resulting injury may be. So what you really need to do as you're evaluating the accident data is look at the accident reports, whether they're taken by one of the rangers or if it's called in, or in our case we even have some law enforcement that assist. Looking at those, evaluating what was the situation and what did the accident involve, so you can really get a good picture of whether the accident, a single victim accident, might have been caused in an avoidance maneuver. Next slide, please. So then, if you can formulate that into different charts for different purposes to present that information to management to justify, you know, the need for different projects. We utilized a public health intern, Charles Oplock, to review over 200 crashes and break those down into the different scenarios. And you can see, you know, over on this column that, you know, the accident data might not have been reported accurately or timely. So, you know, you get those variances. Then you can break that down into risk ratios, into the different nodes and how those you may see trends in those areas. Next slide, please. So if we jump over across the river to Rock Creek, we can see this is a presentation of a chart that they've done that breaks it down a little bit further detail, that you can see that the slips, trips, and falls is the #1 result in an accident. And this particular trail, as we saw in one of the beginning slides, that a poorly maintained trail is worse than no trail. And we've struggled with this on the Rock Creek Trail for years, and how we get in there and maintain that, identifying this. But this breakdown of accidents in the different nodes, just it reinforces the decision to spend some maintenance dollars on that trail. And then this is always a big one here, surface transitions between the roadways or the ramps back up to the trail. And the alignment of those is always a difficult thing to deal with. So next slide, please. And this is a presentation that we're given by Jennifer Chang Dobson and Sarah Newman, and it compares uses on Mount Vernon Trail, Chesapeake, Ohio Canal, and in the National Capital Region, and by age and how those accidents occur. So there you can roll that into educational opportunities targeting different groups, or if they're, you know, in different residential areas, or in some cases we have condos or apartments that you might be able to target those educational opportunities. Next slide, please. So this is where my big interest comes in on how the data is used. You have all of this, and you can really get bogged down into the numbers, but we will use those just like we will a roadway engineering study. In a long-range transportation plan, you use them in evaluation of construction projects, EAs, open houses. The Washington Area Bicycle Association is a huge proponent of the trail system, the corridors, and they keep us very informed. We keep them very informed of how projects are going to affect that. The retrofits, some grant applications. We did a roadway safety audit at Mount Vernon Circle to look at how that trail connections and road crossings could be improved. Short-term projects, realignments, adjustments, transitions, that kind of stuff. Working on a regional trail safety plan and different funding opportunities or partnerships on that, how Park Road Parkway funds might be able to be used on different trails. Special events, what's the impact going to be when you have a construction project or a special event that might be set up days in advance of a commuter route? What are the impacts and how are you going to deal with thousands of bicyclists on their way in and out of the city 2 or 3 days ahead of the inaugural event that's coming up? And then just the maintenance operations of what it takes to keep the trail up and running, leaf clearing, snow removal, just daily O&D stuff. Next slide. So we can break that data down a little bit more in using the accident data, and this is a particular example of where this is the old trail alignment, and we used the accident data that we had to justify and develop a concept and a construction project for a new trail alignment. And you might look at it at first glance, well, what's the difference between the two? Right here, we have 2 lanes of traffic. They're worried about merging into 1 lane of traffic right when we give them a crosswalk for pedestrians. And again, thinking about the numbers, this is a direct connection to Memorial Bridge coming into the city, one of the bridges over the Potomac River. So by moving this trail connection down where the taper has already occurred, the cars have settled in and they'll be more focused on paying attention to the trail crossing. So it's already been pretty successful, and we've seen positive results from this. And this is something that came out of a roadway safety audit that we did earlier this year. So this is a way, some short term, but you can really fix some of those nodes. Next slide, please. So what have we learned out of this whole thing? So, that you can utilize the trail count groups, leveraging your resources, your volunteers, your partnerships with other municipalities that have the same interest of knowing where those trail connections are, using the best trail technology. The photo to the right is a concept of a node that was developed utilizing the trail data and creating a roundabout, which is a little unique in the trail system, but we have a convergence at some odd angles. And so run this through and see if it might work for us a little bit better. Sharing the data, the data analysis, we presented the website, but also, as I talked about, with other municipalities, and documenting the trail by nodes along the trail so that you can identify those, because as we're finding out that the parking lots along the trail are not always used for trailheads. They're used for picnic areas, and they are not always the origination point of the trail users as more and better connections are made to the cities and the neighborhoods adjacent to the trail. Next slide, please. So the program recommendations that we've come up with that we'd like to share with the group: installing automated counters, best data, best technology. You spend a little bit of money, but you get a better product out of it, and it's easier to share that data in this world of technology. conducting the manual counts, it documents, it validates, and it further justifies the expense for the automated counters. Invest the time in developing that volunteer and that partnership network. It really pays off for both. The volunteers a lot of times come from the bicycling or the running community. They want to see the trail improvements. And then also taking advantage of, through the agencies, the public health science, and their risk management, and developing that relationship with the interns, at their interest and for our interest. Next slide, please. This is the long list of all the folks that have been involved in this, and it kind of takes a village to develop something like this, and just the acknowledgement of our partners and all the staff, Arlington County, City of Alexandria, and then also the George Washington Memorial Parkway itself. So with that concludes my presentation. Natalie, back to you.
Great. Thank you, Charles. If there are any questions for Charles, now's the time to ask them. You can use the Q&A drop-down manager, or if you're joining us via your telephone, you can press *8. It looks like, Charles, we only have time for one question before we finish up, and then we'll have some time at the end of the presentation, hopefully, for some questions, too. The first question, or the question is, how much do different counters cost?
The counter system itself installed runs about $3,000. Honestly, one of the issues that we have run into is developing, and I will share as a sole source justification, the best counters are actually from Canada. So as the Federal Land Management Agency, you have to develop this research package to justify buying them. But that is what the other municipalities are using, and to maintain that consistency, that's what we've chosen to use.
Great. That is definitely helpful information. So we're going to move ahead to Rebecca and Davis.
Okay. I will talk a little bit about our monitoring and our Red Hill final report that we put together. If we could have the next slide, please. The Red Hill Committee, as I mentioned before, started out as basically an ad hoc citizens group. We really we were interested in trail use on Red Hill, but we didn't know how to go about doing things, and we interfaced with BLM, and our sophistication level increased over time. One of the first things that we did was, after we met as a group, we identified priorities, objectives, and how we wanted to move forward, and we put together what we call the Red Hill Master Plan Final Report. Part of that report was a survey. I think I mentioned before that when we got started, there were a number of local folks that were using Red Hill. Those groups were primarily hikers. There were some mountain bikers, not many, because the trail system was pretty primitive. And, probably the predominant user group at that time were the high school kids that would go up there on the hill and with some beer and have Friday or Saturday night, have a woodsy up there with a bonfire, and oftentimes we'd go up and we find the fire still smoldering, sometimes 2 or 3 days later. And it's a pinyon juniper forest, which was a real problem. So what we did to assess how the area was being used is put together this Red Hill survey, and this is on the screen here you can see as Exhibit C is the survey instrument. This is only one page of I think it was about 2.5-page survey, asking a whole series of questions. And some of the things that we found out initially was that 71% of the users were close by. They traveled 0 to 5 miles to get there. So those are folks primarily from the Carbondale area and immediately outside of Carbondale. One of the desires of the committee at that time was to look at restricting motorized use. There was very little motorized use. What would happen is there was an old power line access road that went up to a portion of Red Hill, and young folks would take their four-wheel drives and load their drinking products into the back and drive up and find a place to park and have a party. So most folks wanted hiking walking, mountain biking trails with no motorized use. And that wasn't a big problem because there was very little, as I mentioned. So we had a very strong response to that question. 94% wanted to restrict that. Another question we tried to get at was, were you using Red Hill infrequently? Was your use increasing, decreasing, or staying the same? And what we discovered was that the use was increasing, and that was primarily because the trails were being improved, there was more interest and awareness that there was an opportunity there, and that statistic is still taking place. As I showed you originally, we had a graphic of our user days, and they are increasing over time, and they continue to increase. And so that is also a challenge for us in terms of over-impacting the trail area, because we want to take care of the resource. Follow-up surveys are very important. We did this survey approximately 10 years ago, maybe 11 years ago now, and subsequently in 2008, the BLM used students from the University of Arizona to conduct another survey, not only on Red Hill, but in other locations in their resource area. But their survey was focused kind of a little differently than what we were looking at. They were looking at sort of getting feedback on their management strategies, as opposed to, we wanted to find out who these folks were and how they were using Red Hill. And I can talk a little bit about some of those results in a minute here. Then in 2010, we contacted the Colorado Rocky Mountain School, which is a private high school in Carbondale, and one of the teachers there was interested in doing some applied statistics. So we worked with his statistics class and took the original Red Hill survey, and they modified it, they simplified it a little bit, and went out and surveyed users. Now, their methodology was slightly different. I think it was more of a practical thing for them. Our original survey was conducted at the trailhead so that we were getting the folks that were actually heading up to use the trails. They did some of that but weren't very successful doing the trailhead survey, so they relocated to the front of one of our local supermarkets. So their target audience was more focused on Carbondale folks than at the trailhead where people were coming from various locations. But they asked very similar questions to the ones that we asked originally, and it was useful to kind of see what the changes were over time, again, recognizing that their methodology was a little different, so the data got skewed slightly. But I think one of the benefits of using students for this project was there was an opportunity for them to take work outside of their academic environment a little bit and actually do a project that had some benefit to the local community. So that was a very valuable real-world experience for those students, and they could see that the results we actually use. As I mentioned here, doing these follow-up surveys is valuable because you can see how things are changing over time. Is your use leveling off? Is it increasing? In the Carbondale area, there's a whole nother area of BLM that has opened up for primarily mountain biking, but there are also trails for long-distance running and other non-motorized uses. That actually took some of the pressure off Red Hill, which has been, historically was the place to go. And that helps us by taking the pressure off, and our use curve has kind of leveled a little bit. The other value of the survey process is for management, changing demands, changing user characteristics and demographics. In our case, what we were able to note that is that, demand continues to increase. It's primarily focused on the local area, but as word spreads about Red Hill and how fun it is up there, we are seeing people from other parts of the local area, from Eagle, which is about an hour away, folks from Denver, and we even see people from out of state and other countries. that information is gleaned primarily from just personal contacts. When you're up on Red Hill, members of the committee will often interact with folks on the trail and chat with them a little bit to find out where they're from. So that's another way to sort of informally gather information and data. And as I mentioned, doing surveys and involving school kids is a good way to get them involved, pull them out of their traditional academic environment, and engage them in the overall process. So that's you know, a valuable way to get the information. And that concludes my portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Davis. The last section here that we're going to talk about real quick is the plan updates. This is a really important component of developing the plan itself, mainly because, as we talked about with the design standards, you know, with the research that's evolving, needs are basically changing as well. You also, you know, from the information that we've gathered, like Charles talked about, as you continue to learn more, you want to update the plan as projects are implemented. You want to change that as well. And really about every 3 to 5 years is the typical time frame when updates should be performed. And really an important part to ensure that updates will be done is that the agency is identified during the current plan that you're developing so they can look at that in the future. And as an example, the Lake Tahoe Region Bicycle and Pedestrian Plan, their previous plan had discussed completion of 60 miles within 5 years. Unfortunately, 7 years later, when they looked at developing or updating their plan, they only had completed 13 miles. Yet this exercise was useful because they realized that their proposed projects were overlooked by developers and plan reviewers. So they found these 4 steps that they worked to mitigate this and to therefore better implement the proposed projects, like a checklist, the online interactive map. They met with planners and designers from Caltrans and Nevada Department of Transportation, and they added policy language. And so in conclusion, basically what we talked about today, we started off by discussing the many benefits of pedestrian and bicycling. We talked about how partnering is essential. Davis talked early on about, you know, formalizing those partnerships through the Memorandum of Understanding. And we discussed how maintenance should not be overlooked, even though it is somewhat challenging because the grants are not necessarily available to implement maintenance. But I think Charles touched on, again, you know, the value of the maintenance as you start to look at some of the data. We discussed the encouragement through tours, which Dan highlighted the tour in Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, which will help to ensure the use of the facilities that you develop. We had the video where we focused on how you can educate all users of each respective use. And then we followed up here towards the end with the evaluating and monitoring and how that really helps to play back into the plan as a whole. And with that, I wanted to highlight again where you can find the larger document of good practices to encourage bicycling and pedestrians on federal lands. It has many more examples in addition to those wonderful ones that you've heard today. And you can also find a lot of the documents that I've referenced throughout and that our presenters have referenced throughout in our resource library, which is at the website shown here. And these are the list of the ones that are available, which we've obtained permissions for. And with that, I'll pass it over to Amber for questions that we can have.
Great. So we just have a few more minutes for questions. If you have a question, if you can type it in your Q&A drop-down manager, or if you'd like to ask it directly to our presenters, you can press *8 on your telephone keypad. We have, it looks like, one question for Charles so far, and it is, what are the challenges for using volunteers for manual counts?
Well, I mean, one of the biggest challenges is identifying them and getting the organization to get them out there. Just like any type of volunteer activity that you would have, is getting that commitment in advance to plan for. One of the ways that has been helpful is to set up a trail days event adjacent to the trail and just developing or utilizing that activity, that those numbers of people that you have on the Saturday morning, and giving them the educational pamphlets, brochures, stickers, bells. They've, you know, the Parkway has bought bells that they'll hand out, you know, just education on trail courtesy. But it's a lot like some of the same You know, counting the partnerings and developing that collaboration with other cities and municipalities really helps drum up the interest. So hopefully that answers the question.
It does. It does not look like we have any other questions, but we've certainly answered quite a few questions as we've moved through the presentation today. So I think I will conclude today's presentation and thank all of our presenters for participating today. I know that hearing directly from the experienced folks is certainly helpful for our participants, and hearing real-life examples certainly lends to the webinar experience. So thank you to all of you. As a reminder, if you've not visited the TripTac website, there is some valuable information on there. Also, the recording of today's webinar will be posted there as well. So if you've missed anything or you'd like to hear something again, you're more than welcome to watch the recording of today's event. I'll also just remind everybody that the presentation from today, as well as the best practice manual, the bios, and several other handouts are in the handout section of Live Meeting. So please feel free to download that before you leave today. Thank you again to everyone, and have a good afternoon.